Okay, folks, we're going to give it just one more minute here. I see a lot of people have joined, and we'll start promptly at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. I know it's late for a lot of you, so just please hang on for one more minute. Okay, we'll get started. It's 10 o'clock. I want to welcome you to this webinar on continuing our process audits and clause-based look at the standard. Today we're going to talk about auditing the control of non-conforming outputs. I'm going to call it non-conforming products because I've been doing this a while and that's what it used to be called. Know that when I say that, I mean products and services, which is what the standard requires. Okay, advance the chart here. We'll get through this expediently because I know it's late for a lot of you guys, me inclusive. I always like to tie it back to where the topic we're talking about hits the DQS quality policy, just in case anybody asks you the quality policy. You've been exposed to it at least 8 times this year. Process-oriented audits is what we want to deliver, and this topic fits into an audit of production and then a standalone audit of the sampling of records for the disposition of non-conforming product. We also want to focus on the effectiveness of the management system and generate value for the customer. I would say it's a pretty logical conclusion that if you can help the customer not ship non-conforming product to their customers, you're doing a lot in terms of generating value and the effectiveness of the management system. And we want to issue internationally respected certificates. So focusing on this requirement and sampling it appropriately, which we're going to talk about, is how we close the gap there. This is crucial not only for our customers, but for our customers' customers. So for our customer, when we talk about non-conforming product, we're talking about the results of most times sub-processes that are feeding other processes. It's not always the final product going to the customer. So in those cases, maybe they're not shipping products out to end customers that are non-conforming, but they're wasting money, they're wasting resources, and they're incurring higher risk by processing things that were non-conforming or potentially are non-conforming. And then, of course, it protects the customer by making sure they don't get non-conforming products. Almost all of these webinars are born from something I witnessed on an audit, something I saw or heard, something I saw in review, and this one is no different. It kind of comes at us from 2 different ways. The first was a discussion with a newer auditor about what falls under clause 8.7. What is non-conforming product? So in this case, you guys can see these pretty pictures of metal shavings and scrap from a stamping process and scrap from a foam cutting process. And it's true that all of this is scrap, right? But it is not what's covered under clause 8.7 of the standard, which is talking about non-conforming product. This is not product. This is engineering scrap. It's a byproduct of the process. So it doesn't have to be tagged, and it doesn't have to be identified, and it doesn't have to be controlled. Oftentimes you'll find it segregated, and you'll find some control of it, but usually it's for recycling type purposes. So there's no chance that this is going to be shipped to the customer or processed further. So when we think about non-conforming product, scrap is part of it, but not this kind of scrap, engineered scrap. The other reason this came up is recently we've had kind of a little rash of folks claiming compliance of 8.7 and section 3 of the report. So they tick it off. And when they're ticking it off, what you notice in the detail notes and the things that support the audit, the artifacts of the audit, is that they did a great job auditing the guy on the floor, asking about what they do with non-conforming, asking about segregation. There's no evidence that they sampled the disposition of the non-conforming product, that all that stuff that's required in 8.7.2. So that's really, these 2 things together are what made me want to do this as a webinar topic. And we'll go through more on the sampling of records. Going to break down the clause. There's a couple of charts on this. We'll start at the very beginning. So the beginning of clause 8.7 says outputs that do not conform to their requirements must be identified and controlled to prevent unintended use or delivery. So let's break down that sentence. What's an output? Well, ISO 9000 tells us the definition of output is a result of a process. And as I just discussed, that could be an internal process. So stamping press could feed the stamping to a polishing operation, to a plating operation, and then out the door. So it could be a sub-process, or it could be the end process shipping something to a customer. The second part of this underlined is do not conform to requirements. What are the requirements? Well, it depends on where you're standing in the factory. And I'm going to use manufacturing examples. You guys know from listening to these webinars, that's what I tend to. So if you're standing at the stamping press, maybe they have a drawing. Maybe they have a control plan. Maybe they have a router that has what the requirements are supposed to be. So it's really up to the organization to define the requirements and what the requirements are at each station. In a lot of places, you'll see guard banding of different dimensions of the part. So they have it on a tighter tolerance than actually the end use would be. Well, if they do that, well, then they have to hold the part to that tighter tolerance, and they can't just kind of, a lot of times they'll say, well, it doesn't meet that, but I know it meets the drawing, so I'm going to move it forward. And that doesn't fly in our world. Whatever's defined as the requirement is what they have to control it to. The third part of this is identifying and controlling to prevent unintended delivery or use. And we see that normally through tagging, physical segregation, electronic segregation in like ERP systems. Some standards and some customers have to make the part physically unsuitable for use, which is a way of controlling it. Sometimes one method may serve both requirements. So if I take my non-conforming and I lock it in a cage, it's both identified and controlled. I know what it is, and I know that nobody can get to it. So you note it's an and requirement, identified and controlled. So you have to see both. And how do you do it? Well, you do it on the floor, right? The test of identification is you can walk up to a product and clearly know whether it's non-conforming or whether it's good. You should do this throughout your audit of the manufacturing process. This whole concept of auditing the requirements, 8.7, begins with the audit of manufacturing. You don't do the rest of it where we talk about disposition until after you've done the audit of manufacturing. The second part is talking about the test of control. When we talk about control, it's what we're looking for is that someone without ill intent could legitimately mix this up with conforming product and either use it or deliver it. So we're not expecting the clients to make systems that would preclude the use of it by somebody who's trying to do something unethical, but we are expecting them to make systems that preclude the use of it by somebody who's, with all good intentions, trying to make the product, trying to do their job. Okay. Keep moving forward. Next part of the clause, the organization shall take appropriate action based on the nature of the nonconformity and the effect of the conformity of the products and services. So who decides what action to take? Well, the organization decides who decides, primarily. It could be a quality manager, it could be operations, it could be material review board. It's whoever they define. Now, interestingly enough, there's no requirement for a procedure in clause 8.7. That does not mean that they don't have to define responsibility and authority, because we all know that falls under clause 5.3. So they have to define who can make the dispositions. And I said usually it's the organization. That's because sometimes it might be the customer. If they want to ship on a concession or use as is type disposition or repair, which we'll talk about in just a second, those typically require a customer approval to do it. So what are the actions they could take? Well, they could scrap something. They could regrade it, and hopefully I tried to use my example from memory, and hopefully I got it right. In some industries, you'll make a product to a certain specification, and maybe it fails to meet that specification criteria, but it meets a broader specification criteria, so you can regrade it into that broader category. So that happens, I believe, in electronics with resistors and also with capacitors, also happens with chemicals. They could rework it. What's rework? That's basically action to make the product meet the requirements. Repair is action to make the product acceptable, but it doesn't necessarily meet the requirements. So this is a case where they may need a concession from the customer. Concession is used as is, or with repair. Many industries, again, require customer approval. And you may say to me, Dave, how do I know whether it requires customer approval? Well, you're in an industry that hopefully you have the EA code for and you have some familiarity with, but if you don't, you can look at terms and conditions of the contract. You can ask to see customer specific requirements. I mean, we all have kind of this sixth auditor sense where we sort of know the types of customers who have customer specific requirements. So if I'm in the aircraft industry and I'm dealing with the government, I know that they have a deviation process. That's just part of having industry knowledge. But if you don't, there are places you can go to look at the contractual requirements, and you should at least do so a little bit. Try it. The last piece is deviations. So deviations are sort of an industry-specific thing. We see them in automotive, we see them in aerospace, other industries. They're written authorization to depart from a requirement. So there used to be deviations and waivers. Now there's only deviations in the government. Government's Mill Handbook 61. The reason I bring up deviations is to put the concept out there because they're often temporary in nature. So they're approved for a time frame, they're approved for lots, they're approved for serial numbers. So you might ask the question, are you shipping under a deviation? And they'll go, oh yeah, we're shipping under this deviation. Can I see that deviation? Because you want to see what time frame it's approved for. And then you want to take that deviation that you got from them and go, okay, show me what we just shipped and make sure that the thing is still approved for shipment. So if the deviation expired on November 15th and they were shipping product today, guess what? They're shipping non-conforming products. So that would be a major non-conformance. And that's why you want to test, particularly in the area of concessions. You want to make sure they have customer approval to ship when it is required. Okay, so we're still in the top part of clause 8.7. Conformity requirements shall be verified when non-conforming outputs are corrected. So we just talked about repair and we just talked about rework. So if they're going to rework a product, they generally have to re-inspect it, at least the characteristic that was out. Normally, I can't say normally, it happens different in every organization, but a lot of times what you'll see is, they'll take this product and they'll put it right back into the operation that it fell out of and do more machining on it, and they'll inspect it per the requirements of that operation. You see that a lot. There are other cases where the product has been pulled out of line and they'll take it to a rework or repair area. In those cases, you need to test that they have some sort of inspection criteria or inspection plan. Are they doing it to that original criteria? Do they have a special plan for when they do rework and repair? And you want to really test it with the operators that are doing that rework. In some cases, you might be looking at a product that's very complex, a complex system, or particularly in software. So in those cases, just fixing the thing that failed might not be enough. They might have to do something called regression testing. So the classic example of this is software. So a bug is identified with a line of code. And I know we got some software guys on here, and so I apologize. I have some knowledge of software, but certainly not as much as folks on the phone here. So there's a problem with a line of code. And so they fix that line of code. Do they only test that line of code? Do they only test that unit of code, that functionality, or do they have to test other functionality? Because by fixing that line of code, maybe something else got broken. So there's an unintended consequence to the fix. So particularly in complex software, you'll see regression testing and regression test plans, and that's what you should ask for And this is sort of a question you go with them. You look at the type of product and you say, oh, I know I'm talking about software. Hey, when you have a bug fix, do you just test that you repaired the bug? How do you test it? Do you have to do regression testing? They'll understand what you're talking about. So it's a question you're going to lead and see what they have. Okay. So now we get finally to clause 8.7.2. And this is where we're talking about sampling, that thing that we're not consistently doing, but we're checking off 8.7 in section 3. So the requirement says we want to retain documented information that includes description of nonconformity. So it could be scrap ticket, MRB record, stuff you see there. It could be multiple records that encompass all of these different requirements of 8.72. The records need to describe the action taken. That's pretty self-explanatory. Did they scrap it? Did they rework it? Did they repair it? If they are needing any concessions, those concessions need to be obtained. And so now this is important. And this, those of you that do aerospace and automotive and some of the specialty programs will be like, yeah, Dave, I know, you're telling me something I already know, but I'm going to show you evidence of inconsistency. If they're taking a concession, there has to be evidence, documented information, that the customer approved it. They can't just tell you, oh, the customer says it's okay. Oh, we've been shipping it this way for 30 years and they never reject it. They know. You need something in writing. That something in writing needs to be from the proper authority. It can't be just anybody at the customer. So you need to have a level of awareness, and some of this might be looking at customer specific requirements. Who at the customer can approve a concession? Then internally, their records need to identify the authority deciding the action. So who is making the disposition? And again, you need to be alert. The next chart, this is a real example. I pulled this out of a report. It came from a form report, and I'm not picking on anybody because I've used this a few times, but it's a current example actually. If you read this finding, basically it says during the audit observed out of tolerance, and he talks about some measured values, and this was at final part inspection. So this is kind of your slam dunk major nonconformance for the shipping and nonconforming. Then he goes on to say, and it was a he, minor AR raised for out of tolerance on final measurement. QA manager confirms that the customer, Schneider, agreed to deviation for a long time. There's no customer confirmation evidence for the deviated tolerance. So basically, he's telling us that there's no customer approval, but he made it a minor anyway. When you see this, this is a major nonconformance. So this is the situation I just described. And when you're playing in this clause and doing the process audit with this clause, you need to be very attuned, because this, in looking at inspection records, are two of the places where it's most readily identified a major nonconformance for the shipping and nonconforming product. So I'm going to lay out a scenario, and then we're going to launch a poll for you guys. It'll be a quick one. So the organization is going for an ISO 9001 certification. They have a process for control of non-conforming product. You saw it on the floor. They red tag it and they segregate it per their procedure. Everything's cool. Now, when they have non-conforming product, they have a whiteboard out on the floor. It's in the production area. And on that whiteboard is the grid you see here. They record the part number, they record the description, their disposition, who did it, the authority, and the action that was taken. So far, it sounds pretty good. At the end of the week, all the ones that are dispositioned are erased. Does it comply with clause 8.7? I'm going to launch a poll here. So here's the deal. It's a whiteboard. It has all these topics on it. Use your knowledge of the clause and what we just discussed. Does this situation comply? Okay, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to, while it's distributing the poll. People are voting. We got about half the people have voted. I'm going to give it 15 more seconds, folks. So 10 more seconds. About 75% have voted. We're doing good, 80%. A couple of you out there haven't voted yet. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. So the answer is it depends. Really, this is less about 8.7 than it is about records retention. So in general, it's probably not going to comply. It depends on how they define the record, depends on what they said the record retention was. And what's really important, and I think some of you picked it up, was some of these dispositions, like this one in particular, is used as is. And it got dispositioned by CB, but do we have a record that the customer also approved that disposition? So this is hammering home, when you have these dispositions that require concession, and typically it's going to be used as is, it's going to be repair. Does the customer have a requirement to approve it? And do they have evidence of that approval? And of course, a whiteboard wouldn't be that evidence. But most of you said, most of you got this right. And so well done. Okay, I like to give you a sequence. And here's your sequence. So it all starts on the floor, right? This is the part we do well. You're asking people to measure parts, you're watching them do it, you ask them what they do if it's in tolerance, you ask them what they do if it's out of tolerance, and they talk to you about segregation, they talk to you about tagging. You ask them if they record it anywhere, and they show you somewhere where they record it. You ask them if they have to tag it or store it anywhere. They say they have to segregate it, you go with them to where they store it. Notes and part numbers, dates, jobs numbers of what's in the cage. Now, when you're done auditing production, or when you've got a lot of production audited, enough where you go, okay, I got this down, I've seen it. Now you're going to maybe switch gears. This is a good thing to do when there's a break, right? So you're out there auditing and everybody goes on break, right? So what are you going to do for 15 minutes? Well, you could go on break, but that's not really audit time. Or you could turn to your guide and go, I have some questions about the disposition of non-conforming product. And so this is something you're going to ask to a quality manager, an operations manager, somebody like that. You want to ask about how the responsibility and authority is defined. You can ask for a procedure. They don't have to have one, but they have to define the responsibility and authority. Then you could start asking some questions down. Is there a disposition process? If you repair or use it as is, do you need customer approval? When do you need customer approval? If you rework or repair items, how do you ensure they conform? You want to see some records of the reinspection. When I'm pulling records, and this is all kind of together because now we're talking about record pulling, I'm trying to get some that are scrap disposition, some that are repair, some that are rework, some that are used as is. I want a cross section of the dispositions. Why do I want that? Because it gets me different requirements in the standard. If I only get all scrap, well, then I don't have a good place to talk about repair or talk about concessions. If I get some examples where they've done a use as is, or they've done a repair, or they've done a rework, well, now I can ask these other questions and I can leverage the sample to prove the effectiveness of the system. So you want to look at 6 to 8. I always tend to 8. You want to go back for the past year and you want to have cross-sectional sampling. Okay, one more thing to consider doing. Most companies these days have electronic controls. So they'll have an ERP system or whatever type of system where they'll be entering this stuff. Say, hey, I'd like to see what's open for disposition or what's been dispositioned. Write it down. Write down the part number, write down the job number, the pertinent information, the date when it's been dispositioned. You should be able to lay hands on anything that they're saying is still in the building. They should be able to show it to you. You should be able to test whether it's identified and segregated. So this is a little bit of a harsher or more thorough, I guess that's a better way to say it, test of the effectiveness of the system. Because when you're out on the floor, you're kind of doing a walkabout. It's a little bit random, right? So they're showing you something. You're being led somewhere. In this case, you're looking at a system that says what the non-conforming product is. Now you're going to walk out there and expect to see it tagged and expect to see it segregated. And what do you do if you can't find it? If you can't find it, does that mean they have control? Did they ship it? So now you're in the realm of a potential major for the probable shipping of non-conforming product. And it is kind of fun. You get to walk around a little bit and you get to truly, not to make light of it, but you get to truly test the system and the system's effectiveness. So I highly recommend that when you're done sampling all the records, you ask this question about whether they electronically control it. You ask what they think they have, and you go out and check at least, 5 or 10 of them and make sure you can find them all. That's a true test of the effectiveness of that part of the system. 2019 has been the year of sampling. We've talked about sampling in every one of these. We talked about it at the national meeting, and we're going to talk about it one more time at every time of the night it is here. Online in the auditor portal, there's a Word document that has all the tables in it. This is one of the tables that I clipped out. You're welcome to take that Word document and modify it any way you want. It's not a controlled document. It's a way to take notes. So you can do what you want with it. So part number, description, date. It's always good to have dates so we can see your sampling back in time. Whether it's identified and controlled, is the non-conformity described, actions taken, and disposition authority. So again, I started with this. If you have not gone back and sampled those records, you can't really take credit for auditing 8.7. You shouldn't be ticking it off because you didn't do the whole requirement. And we want to do the whole requirement when we're doing this. Okay, so I said I'd keep it short because it's late at night. So again, it's more than just asking the operator what they do and seeing the tagging. There's requirements for documentation. There's requirements for disposition. We want to hit on customer specific requirements. We did a whole, it wasn't a webinar, but it was a video about customer specific requirements. And this is one area where most customers are going to have something. You need to see records of this disposition, sampling, going back in time. And again, just to say it one more time, if you haven't done the record sampling, you can't claim that you did 8.7. So with that, we're going to launch one more poll, and then I'm going to let you go. So hang on 1 second. It's distributing. Okay, so you guys can see it now. Okay, we got about half the people voting. Okay, 90% voted. Oh, we need one more person, 95%. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. The answer was all of the above, and everyone got it right. So I want to thank everybody for their attendance. I'll be making the certificates and getting them out to you tomorrow. Thanks for dialing in so late, and much love to the West Coast. Hopefully we won't have to do it this late for a couple more rounds. Everybody have a great evening. If you're traveling, travel safe. Talk to you later.